Hey there. Before we get into today's episode, let me tell you about a great podcast discovery service. And I know what you're thinking. Josh, we hear about earbuds and indie drop-in every week. Give us something new. Well, if you are actually thinking that, then I just read your mind. Go check out WTF to Listen To on Instagram. They recently featured obscure history in their story and on their page, and recommended this show to their audience, so I'm paying them back. WTF to Listen To is a great place to find recommendations for podcasts, books, music, and more. Their page is super informative and features some very trendy branding. Go check them out today if you're just dying to find something new to fill your ear void. Last week we learned of two boys who lived long ago in a place much like our own. They were separated by an ocean and their national allegiance. They trained to fight and kill and maim each other. And one of the boys even acted on that training. Under most circumstances, their stories would have ended with the war, but these two boys were stronger than their circumstance. Their fates were tied together. My name is Josh, and this is Obscure History. Last week we talked a bit about why we go to war. But there's something else here, even more primal to think about. Go ahead and open up your phone. Go to your favorite or least favorite social media app and just scroll. Count how many seconds it takes for you to find something hateful. I bet that it's less than 60. It sometimes feels like we're living in a world where anger is the default reaction and the ability to respect people of varying beliefs and backgrounds is a lost art. And it goes beyond simply grumpy grandparents on Facebook. According to Southern Poverty Law Center, a well-respected organization that studies hate crime in the United States, hate groups grew by 900% between 2016 and 2018 alone. In an updated article, they report that the number shrank slightly in 2020, but they are still monitoring over 800 individual hate groups of varying backgrounds and with diverse political objectives. So sadly, we can conclude that the feeling of impending dread that we all feel is more than just access to everybody's innermost thoughts on social media. It's a real phenomenon. But why? There are a lot of interesting theories as to why we simply cannot resist hatred. According to Psychology Today, behavioral researcher Patrick Wanis cites the in-group, out-group theory, which posits that when we feel threatened by perceived outsiders, we instinctively turn toward our in-group, those with whom we identify, as a survival mechanism. Wanis explains, hatred is driven by two key emotions, of love and aggression. One, love for the in-group, the group that is favored, and two, aggression for the out-group, the group that has been deemed as being different, dangerous, and a threat to the in-group. Alternatively, according to Washington, D.C. clinical psychologist Dana Herron, the things people hate about others are the things that they fear within themselves. She suggests thinking about the targeted group or person as a movie screen onto which we project unwanted parts of the self. The idea is, I'm not terrible, you are. This phenomenon is known as projection, a term coined by Freud to describe our tendency to reject what we don't like about ourselves. Psychologist Brady Reedy further describes projection as our need to be good, which causes us to project badness outward and then attack it. Those are very solid thoughts, but there are many other theories out there on the subject. For example, psychologist Bernard Golden, author of Overcoming Destructive Anger, Strategies That Work, believes that when hatred involves participation in a group, it may help foster a sense of connection and camaraderie that fills a void in one's identity. He describes hatred of individuals or groups as a way of distracting oneself from the more challenging and anxiety-provoking task of creating one's own identity. Acts of hate are attempts to distract oneself from feelings such as helplessness, powerlessness, injustice, inadequacy, and shame. Hate is grounded in some sense of perceived threat. It is an attitude that can give rise to hostility and aggression toward individuals or groups. Like much of anger, it is a reaction to and distraction from some form of inner pain. The individual consumed by hate may believe that the only way to regain some sense of power over his or her pain is to preemptively strike out at others. In this context, each moment of hate is a temporary reprieve from inner suffering. Or perhaps the problem isn't within us as individuals, but is instead a cultural influence on our behavior. According to Silvia Ducevici, president and founder of Critical Therapy Center, hatred lies not only in our psychological makeup or family history, but also in our cultural and political history. We live in a war of culture that promotes violence, in which competition is a way of life, she says. We fear connecting because it requires us to reveal something about ourselves. We are taught to hate the enemy, meaning anyone different than us, which leaves little room for vulnerability and an exploration of hate through empathetic discourse and understanding. In our current society, one is more ready to fight than resolve conflict. Peace is seldom the option. Honestly, all of those make perfect sense to me, but there is another, slightly more mysterious possibility. The 50-year cycle of rage. In researching for this episode, I came across this very interesting theory. According to the 50-year cycle of rage theory, American society has spikes of rage about 50 years apart, and has basically since the country began. These relatively short waves of violence often follow well-known and oft-studied economic cycles like the Kontriev wave, which hypothesizes that behaviors of an economic system could be understood and predicted. Specifically, these cycles of expansion, stagnation, and recession occur about every 40 to 60 years. Economists and historians don't seem to agree on exactly what the Kontriev wave is, or even if the 50-year cycle of rage is a fact, but they do seem to be interested in it, and they tend to agree that both of those phenomena have some kind of authenticity. Perhaps the most telling thing that I found in my research was an article written in 2012. In August of 2012, Natalie Wolkover wrote the following for Live Science. She says, circa 1870, the North fought against the South in the Civil War. Half a century later, around 1920, worker unrest, racial tensions, and anti-communist sentiment caused another nationwide upsurge in violence. Then, 50 years later, the Vietnam War and Civil Rights Movement triggered a third peak in violent political, social, and radical conflict. 50 years after that will be 2020. If history continues to repeat itself, we can expect a violent upheaval in the United States in a few years. I mean, maybe it's just a coincidence, but that article does seem shockingly spot on. Forgiveness is difficult, largely because of this inclination to hate, whether it's natural and innate or cyclical and conditional. Despite being a foundational tenet in basically every major world religion, actually forgiving somebody who has wronged us is one of the most challenging parts about being a person. Once an individual has been harmed, there are two typical responses: revenge and negative reciprocacy. In the scenario where revenge is the chosen method of response, things can become quite troubling rather quickly. An eye for an eye and all that. And sadly, it's the response that is chosen far too often. Everything from the Hatfields and McCoys to the Israel-Palestine conflict can be boiled down in some way to offense and revenge. And even more troubling is the fact that in conflict everyone has justification. Oftentimes each party will claim just revenge to explain their actions. The healthier response is negative reciprocacy. Essentially, you harmed me a little, I harm you a little in equal measure. Where revenge seeks only to destroy the object of offense, negative reciprocacy actually seeks to rehabilitate the offender by measuring out suffering in equal proportion to that which the individual experienced. When you were 15 and you stayed out past curfew, your parents likely responded this way. You committed the offense of breaking a household rule. You were harmed in equal proportion by being disallowed from driving for 2 weeks. In a roundabout way, negative reciprocacy actually leaves room for rehabilitation and forgiveness. When your parents punished you for breaking a household rule or your teacher assigned you detention for skipping class, there was room for you to make amends and learn from your transgressions. In a revenge scenario, they wouldn't have left room for healing and growth. Rather than grounding you, they would have kicked you out for good, and rather being assigned to detention, they would have lobbied for your expulsion. I think this is why we are so attracted to stories of forgiveness. It's a foreign concept to most, and even to those who spend time and energy consciously trying to learn the skill of forgiveness, it's a difficult task. We love to see stories of redemption because we all understand how challenging those scenarios can be in reality. It's for this exact reason that I was drawn to the story of Nobuo Fujita and James Douglas Peterson. But before we get to that, we need to get into some ads. Sit tight for about 90 seconds, you'll hear 3 quick ads from our sponsors, and when we get back, we'll wrap up this amazing tale. The year was 1962, the 20th anniversary of Nobuo Fujita's attack on the Oregon coast. Through channels that I have yet to uncover, a group of young business owners in Brookings, Oregon discovered the identity of the man who had attempted to set the Oregon forests ablaze, and they had an interesting idea. The Brookings Junior Chamber of Commerce, or the JCs as they were called, intended to bring Nobuo Fujita to Brookings for their annual Azalea Festival as a show of forgiveness, goodwill, and friendship. This idea sounds lovely, however, it was not embraced by all. The JCs posted their intentions in the newspaper and asked for community input, and what they received was far more dire than they could have ever anticipated. Letters were sent to the newspaper which had run the JC's article. They argued that if they were to invite Nobuo Fujita to town, they might as well invite Judas Iscariot and Attila the Hun. They sent death threats to the members of the JCs and their families. They used racial slurs. They threatened Nobuo Fujita. The community dissolved into hatred. It was at this point that the JCs decided that quick, concise leadership was needed. They decided that despite the public outrage, they would bring Nobuo Fujita to Brookings one way or another. Though the JCs made the decision as a group, the president of the Junior Chamber of Commerce at the time was a man named James Douglas Peterson. Peterson, who went by Doug, was born January 19, 1921 in Genoa, Nebraska, to Bill and Thelma Peterson. He had one older sibling named Rod. The family had moved to Portland, Oregon in 1943. After high school, he went to the College of Pharmacy at Oregon State University. After graduating in pharmacy, he enlisted in the United States Air Force, where he spent 5.5 years. He was separated from the Air Force as a captain and then worked as a pharmacist in Beaverton in Newport. In 1955, Frenchie Errol convinced him to come to Brookings as a full partner. He and Frenchie were partners for over 40 years. Even in his young age, Peterson was a leader in his community, and he, as well as the other members of the JCs, were using their positions to extend goodwill toward a man who had harmed them. The community was primed with hatred and the very recent memories of a bloody and devastating war. And as Nobuo Fujita's arrival inched closer, the police began making arrests. Those who made threats were treated as if they had already committed the acts. The Brookings police held certain citizens in jail during the duration of the Fujita's visit. And despite all of the turmoil, the visit was pleasant. Nobuo Fujita, who once bombed this country, sampled the delights of a small-town festival Saturday and found them wonderful. Later, Fujita flew over the forests around Brookings, this time as a peacetime passenger. On landing, he stepped out with a happy grin and said it had been fun. It was a simulated replay with newfound friends of his 1942 bombing run. And wherever he, his wife, and their son appeared, there were smiles, applause, and the inevitable autograph line. In Japan, people have never seen such a wonderful parade, said the son, Yasuyoshi, 25, speaking for his parents who do not know English. My mother and father, he went on, said the queen of your Azalea festival looks like the crown princess of our country, maybe even more beautiful. He smiled. His parents bowed, and a crowd of several hundred applauded. This was a part of a sun-baked day of busy affairs at which the Fujitas were special guests. The Brookings Junior Chamber of Commerce invited them to the city and its annual Azalea Festival as a gesture of international goodwill. This is the 20th anniversary year of the Japanese bombing of the forests near Brookings. Fujita conceived the plan of aerial attack from a submarine-based plane, and was the pilot who carried out the cold but fruitless mission. Saturday morning, the Fujitas stood at the curb in front of the movie theater on Main Street as the festival parade came by. Little children surrounded them. Fujita, a wiry, smiling man who keeps his youthful look, stood with his hands on the shoulder of a small boy and tapped in time as the band marched by. It has been just fine, said Doug Peterson, who was the president of the JCs when they first got the idea of asking the Fujitas to Brookings. It sounds as if Nobuo Fujita had a lovely time, but the newspapers didn't report on everything that happened during his visit. While the people of Brookings opened their arms to the Fujita family, there was a darkness underneath it all. When Fujita arrived, he presented a family heirloom to the Brookings Junior Chamber of Commerce. It was a 400-year-old samurai sword that had been passed down through the generations. It was in the cockpit of his plane during every mission that he flew. It had been in the hands of his ancestors as they trained and fought. It was a symbol of his repentance. Had the city of Brookings not accepted his apologies, Nobuo Fujita had planned to commit seppuku with that very blade in a final attempt to absolve himself of the shameful things that he had done. However, the city of Brookings welcomed Nobuo Fujita and his family, and he was so moved that he returned, and he returned again, and he invited 3 students from Brookings High School to Japan to study abroad. President John F. Kennedy commended the city of Brookings for their great efforts to establish peace and friendship between the U.S. and Japan. In 1992, on the 50th anniversary of his attack, Nobuo Fujita returned to Brookings and planted a coastal redwood near the same patch of forest on Mount Emily, which had once been his target. President Reagan acknowledged the beauty of this relationship in a written statement thanking Nobuo Fujita in 1985. And days before his death in 1997, the town of Brookings elected to make Nobuo Fujita an honorary citizen. In the Brookings Library, in a display case, still sits that 400-year-old katana. A tool for destruction, a symbol of the Fujita family identity, an offering of peace. In the end, in this story, forgiveness overcame revenge. It trumped hatred and prejudice, and from those rifles, plowshares were crafted. You see, there is a third option. We respond by revenge, negative reciprocacy, or with grace. This story of redemption made few headlines. It is not well known, but it's important. The Brookings Junior Chamber of Commerce proved that extending grace, even when it's dangerous, can be the most powerful of human expressions. And maybe that's the point of it all. Maybe grace is supposed to be given when it costs you something. Maybe it only works when you offer it, knowing full well that your peers might hate you for it, or that they might even try to harm you for it. Maybe that's it. Convenient grace seems an impotent salve. But maybe, just maybe, if we follow the lead of the Brookings JCs, we can also make a big impact in our little corner of the world. All right, everybody. Thank you so much for listening. I appreciate all of you. You are the absolute best. You may have noticed that I missed a couple of Thursday footnotes. That is because the first one I missed was going to be on my birthday. I think we already talked about that one. And last week, I realized that if I do a Thursday footnote in the middle of a 2-part series, I might give away all of the second episode. So I decided against putting one out last week. I tried to scramble to put something together at the last minute, but it didn't seem like it was going to come together, and I didn't want to give you something that was subpar. So apologies going forward. I think that I'm working out the kinks with Thursday footnotes as we go, but I've been happy with it so far. You could probably expect one this week, though I can't make any promises about anything. I promise I'll try my best to bring you a Thursday footnote. As always, this episode was brought to you in part by Earbud Podcast Collective and Indie Drop-In. Both of those services are the absolute best at finding you your new second favorite show. I have made that their unofficial motto. I haven't told Ariel or Greg that yet, but I'm sure they'll be fine with it. Also, just in preparation for Thursday footnotes, if you've listened this far in the episode and would like to submit some listener questions, the channels are always open. I always like to hear from you guys, especially if you've got a question for Thursday footnotes, because I usually end up having to beg for those on Wednesday. You can get at me at obscurehistorypod@gmail.com, on Twitter at allthepeoplepod, because it does not let you change your username, or on Instagram at obscurehistorypodcast, because it does let you change your username. Or if you just want to tell the world about this show, but you don't really want to reach out to me for some reason, you can always leave a rating and review on iTunes. I always forget to ask for that. It's kind of a big deal. It helps the show weirdly way more than you would probably ever expect. All right, taking us out this week is Feel My Flow by Virgo Gabrielle. Again, if you would like to have your music played on this show, like the Mileage did a few weeks ago, just send it in to any of those channels. I would be more than happy to feature the music of somebody that actually listens to the show. Although, I suspect that maybe Virgo Gabrielle does, or maybe they are just very attentive to my social media. Anyways, check them out. I'll leave some links. Their music's great. I really, really enjoy it. It's got a really cool, unique vibe. But anyways, I gotta go to bed. I've got work in the morning, and it is definitely going to be an adventure. So you guys, have a nice night. I'll talk to you on Thursday.
Lifestyle's out of control, yeah. But so am I, so I could do it, yeah, yeah.